This story isn't just an epic movie script, it's real. If you're craving a tale of suspense that keeps you on the edge, a last-minute hero's reveal that takes your breath away, and a romance as powerful as it is unexpected, then look no further. The Book of Esther is in a league of its own. This isn't fiction, it's history laced with divine purpose. Imagine a young woman, plucked from obscurity, thrust into the glittering yet dangerous world of the Persian royal court. Her people face annihilation. The clock is ticking, and the fate of an entire nation rests on her shoulders. Esther's courage, God's silent power, and the twists that defy imagination create a story like no other. And here's the twist. The name of God is never mentioned, yet his presence is everywhere, weaving through palace halls and shadowed conspiracies. The suspense will grip you, the romance will move you, and the final act will leave you in awe of God's unseen hand. Presented to you by Deep Bible Stories, this isn't just a tale to read. It's a life-changing message of faith, courage, and divine providence. Share this video with someone you know who needs the reminder that God's power is alive, even when he seems silent. With that, let's dive into the Book of Esther, where the invisible becomes undeniable. Before we get into the fascinating story of Esther, the palace intrigue, the courage of a queen, and the dramatic twists that saved a nation, let's start at the beginning. Who wrote this timeless tale? It's a question shrouded in mystery, much like the story itself. The Book of Esther is unique not just because of its riveting plot, but because no one knows for certain who authored it. Could it have been Mordecai, Esther's cousin and mentor, who lived every moment of this extraordinary saga? Or perhaps it was a Jewish historian in exile, someone determined to immortalize the courage of one woman and the deliverance of an entire people. Some scholars suggest it might have been written years later by a scribe, recounting the story during the reign of King Xerxes, a time when the Jewish people were clinging to their faith while navigating life in a foreign empire. The Persian Empire sets a striking backdrop for this tale. Spanning from modern-day India to Ethiopia, it was a colossal kingdom ruled with absolute authority. King Xerxes, or Ahasuerus as he's called in the Hebrew text, governed from his palace in Susa, a city of opulence, where golden thrones, wine-filled banquets, and political machinations coexisted. Within these walls, Esther's story unfolded, weaving its way into the tapestry of history with threads of courage, faith, and survival. And yet, amidst all the richness of its narrative, the Book of Esther does something extraordinary. It never once mentions God by name. Not a single prayer is explicitly recorded, no miracles are openly declared. Why would such a crucial part of the Bible leave out the very name of the one who orchestrates it all? This absence is not an oversight. It's a masterstroke. Some believe the omission reflects the reality of Jewish life in exile, where faith often had to thrive in silence, in secret. Others argue it's an intentional literary device, forcing the reader to search for God's hand in the hidden moments, in the twists and turns that seem almost too perfect to be coincidence. Think about it: Esther's rise to queenhood, Mordecai's overhearing of a deadly plot, Haman's downfall. All these moments weave together with precision, as though guided by an unseen hand. The message is clear: even when God seems silent, even when his name is not spoken, he is still at work, turning ordinary events into extraordinary acts of providence. And then there's the story's structure, crafted with the tension of a political thriller and the emotional weight of a drama. Esther reads like a carefully written scroll meant to keep you on the edge of your seat. From the lavish Persian court to the gallows meant for Mordecai, every chapter builds toward a climax that leaves no doubt about the power of courage, faith, and divine timing. As we dive deeper into the story of Esther, it's worth remembering the mystery behind its authorship. Perhaps it's fitting that the writer remains unnamed. The Book of Esther isn't just about one woman, one people, or even one moment in history. It's about the unseen God who orchestrates deliverance through courage and obedience, working through the seemingly ordinary to achieve the extraordinary. So, before we move into Esther's rise to queenhood and her daring actions, let me ask, have you ever felt God's presence in a moment when he seemed absent? Have you experienced his providence woven into the tapestry of your life? Let's continue this journey and see how the hidden hand of God transformed not just Esther's life, but the destiny of an entire nation. From the hidden mystery of Esther's authorship, we now step onto the stage where her story unfolds, a stage unlike any other in history. The Persian Empire under King Xerxes, known as Ahasuerus in the Hebrew text. Picture this, a kingdom so vast it stretched across 127 provinces, from the golden sands of India to the sun-soaked lands of Ethiopia. It was an empire of unimaginable wealth and power, ruled by a man whose word was law, whose whims could topple cities, and whose decrees could decide the fate of nations. Here, in the opulent city of Susa, the very heart of Persian authority, Esther's life would intertwine with destiny. Susa wasn't just any city, it was a place of grandeur. The royal palace shimmered like a jewel, its walls adorned with marble, ivory, and gold. Lavish gardens spilled out across the courtyards where fountains danced and exotic flora scented the air. Banquets here were no ordinary meals. They were festivals of excess with flowing wine, extravagant feasts, and a king eager to display his boundless wealth. But behind the gilded walls and velvet drapes of the palace, the Persian court was a world of cunning politics and dangerous intrigue. Nobles jockeyed for power. Alliances were as fragile as glass, and the king's favor could shift like the desert winds. This was not a stage for the faint-hearted, but it was precisely the stage God chose for his providence to unfold. Esther's story begins with the fall of another queen, Vashti, whose refusal to parade herself before the king's drunken guests led to her swift dismissal. It's easy to see this as a moment of disgrace, but what if it was a divine reset, a clearing of the stage for the true heroine to step forward? Vashti's departure left a void, and Xerxes, urged by his advisors, set out to fill it. Across the empire, young women were summoned to Susa for a royal beauty contest, where the winner would be crowned queen. It's here that we meet Hadassah, a Jewish orphan living in exile under the care of her cousin Mordecai. Known by her Persian name, Esther, she was beautiful, yes, but more than that, she was wise, courageous, and obedient to the God whose hand was guiding her every step. Imagine the tension as Esther was taken from her humble home to the palace, swept into a world of wealth and privilege that seemed galaxies away from her people's struggles. But even as Esther ascended, danger loomed in the shadows. The Persian Empire was a place where decrees could not be undone, where enemies of God's people schemed in secret, and where the fate of nations could hinge on a single moment of courage. One such enemy was Haman, a man whose hatred for Mordecai and the Jewish people would drive him to plot genocide, a scheme that would ultimately collide with Esther's destiny. Yet, despite the absence of God's name, his fingerprints are everywhere in this story. The wealth of the Persian Empire, the might of its king, and the scheming of its courtiers, all were pieces on a divine chessboard, moving in ways no one could predict. Esther's selection as queen was not a coincidence. It was providence in action. Think about the improbability of it all. A young Jewish woman from an exiled people rising to become the queen of the most powerful empire on earth. What are the odds? In human terms, slim to none. But with God, the odds didn't matter. The Persian Empire, with all its wealth, power, and politics, was simply the backdrop for his story. A story of salvation, of courage, and of promises kept. As we continue this journey, consider the power of providence in your own life. Are there moments that seemed like chance, but were later revealed as divine design? Have you ever found yourself on a stage far beyond your imagining, with God guiding your steps? From the grandeur of the Persian Empire, where intrigue brewed behind golden doors, we now step into a pivotal moment that changed the course of history, a queen's bold refusal that set the stage for God's hidden plan. Esther's rise to royalty begins with a scandal, one that shook the very foundation of King Xerxes' court. The Book of Esther opens with a royal feast that can only be described as extravagant beyond imagination. For 180 days, Xerxes showcased his empire's splendor, culminating in a 7-day banquet for the elite of Susa. The wine flowed freely, the tables overflowed with delicacies, and the atmosphere was electric with power and indulgence. It was during this display of excess that Xerxes made a fateful command. Queen Vashti was to appear before the drunken crowd to display her beauty. Now, imagine Vashti, a queen in her own right, a woman of grace and dignity, receiving this command. The king's order wasn't a request for her presence as a partner, but a demand to parade herself before the eyes of leering men. Her refusal was swift, and it was resolute. The text doesn't give us Vashti's internal monologue, but we can feel her courage in that moment. She wasn't just defying her husband, she was defying the most powerful man in the known world. Queen Vashti also gave a banquet for the women in the royal palace of King Xerxes. Esther 1:9. This detail suggests that Vashti was a leader, a host, a woman of influence, but her defiance came at a steep cost. Enraged by her refusal, Xerxes consulted his advisors, who feared that Vashti's rebellion would inspire women throughout the empire to rise up against their husbands. Their advice: remove her from the throne and decree that every man should rule over his household. And just like that, Vashti was stripped of her crown. The queen who once stood beside Xerxes was cast out, her name remembered in history as both a symbol of defiance and a casualty of pride. But was Vashti's fall simply the end of her story, or was it the beginning of another? Here lies the mystery of God's providence. Vashti's refusal created a void, and that void would soon be filled by Esther. What seemed like a moment of disgrace was, in fact, a divine reset. The stage was being cleared for a new queen, one whose courage and faith would save a nation. What can we learn from Vashti's story? Some see her as a cautionary tale, a woman whose defiance led to her downfall. Others see her as a heroine, standing firm in her convictions despite the consequences. Perhaps she is both, a reminder that courage often comes with a price, and that even in the fallout of bold choices, God is still at work. For the Jewish people, scattered across the Persian Empire, the events in Xerxes' court might have seemed like distant royal drama. But behind the scenes, God was moving pieces into place. The removal of Vashti wasn't just a political maneuver, it was a divine opening for Esther's rise. As we transition to Esther's story, consider this. Have you ever faced a moment where standing firm meant losing something significant? How did God use that moment to shape the next chapter of your life? Share your story in the comments, and don't forget to share deep Bible stories with someone who needs to see how courage and consequences can weave into God's plan. Now, the stage is set. Vashti has fallen, and the search for a new queen begins. Little does Xerxes know, this search will bring him a young woman whose faith and bravery will change the fate of an entire nation. Let's step into Esther's story. The royal court was abuzz with urgency and intrigue. Vashti's defiance had left an empty throne, a vacancy that rippled through the empire. Xerxes, a king of impulsive pride, demanded a new queen, and his advisors, eager to soothe his wounded ego, proposed a solution, a kingdom-wide search for the most beautiful young woman to take Vashti's place. Little did they know, this search would bring to light a woman who carried not just beauty, but the hidden purposes of God. From the opulence of the palace, we now turn to a modest home in the bustling city of Susa, where an orphan girl named Hadassah lived. Her name, meaning myrtle, symbolized peace and righteousness. She was a Jewish exile, raised by her older cousin Mordecai, a man of wisdom and deep faith. But in the shadows of the Persian Empire, her true heritage had to be hidden for her safety. To the outside world, she was Esther, a name reflecting the Persian word for star. Esther's early life was marked by loss and displacement. Her parents were gone, and her people lived as foreigners under Persian rule. Yet, in the quiet corners of her life, God was shaping her character, preparing her for a destiny no one could foresee. When the king's edict went out, calling for young women to be gathered into the royal harem, Esther was among those chosen. Imagine her fear, leaving the safety of Mordecai's care to enter the opulent yet dangerous world of the palace. What thoughts raced through her mind as she walked through the gilded halls, surrounded by strangers, competing for the favor of a king who had discarded his previous queen on a whim. But Esther's journey wasn't just about beauty or charm, it was about grace. In a world where power was wielded ruthlessly, Esther stood out for her kindness, humility, and wisdom. The text tells us that she pleased him and won his favor. Esther 2:9. The him in this verse is Hegai, the king's eunuch, who oversaw the women in the harem. His favor granted Esther special privileges, yet her success was no mere coincidence. It was the hidden hand of God, orchestrating every detail. Over months of preparation, Esther's inner qualities began to shine as brightly as her outward beauty. And when the time came for her to meet King Xerxes, the decision was swift. The king was attracted to Esther more than to any of the other women, and she won his favor and approval. Esther 2:17. He placed the royal crown on her head, declaring her queen of Persia. Esther's ascension from orphan to queen might seem like a fairy tale, but it was far from random. Her rise wasn't about chance, it was about purpose. God placed her in the palace not for her own comfort, but for a mission that would soon unfold. As the celebrations of Esther's coronation echoed through the empire, her cousin Mordecai remained vigilant. He lingered near the palace gates, keeping an ear to the ground, protecting Esther even from afar. His wisdom would soon prove invaluable, but for now the world saw only a new queen, unaware of the divine plan quietly taking shape. Esther's journey is a testament to the transformative power of divine favor. From the shadows of obscurity, she rose to a position of influence, chosen not just by a king, but by the King of Kings. Have you ever felt unqualified for a calling or out of place in a season of your life? Esther's story reminds us that God often uses the least likely people in the most unlikely ways. Her ascent to the throne wasn't just for her benefit, it was for the salvation of her people. As we move forward, the stakes will grow higher. A sinister plot against the Jewish people is brewing, and Esther will be called upon to risk everything. But for now, let us pause and marvel at how God can take an orphan girl and place her in a position of royalty for his purposes. Esther's rise was just the beginning. What would you do if you realized your position wasn't about privilege, but purpose? Esther's rise to queenhood was a moment of divine positioning, but the true weight of her calling had yet to be revealed. While she adjusted to life in the palace, an unseen enemy was already plotting against her people. Little did she know the fate of an entire nation would soon rest on her courage and faith. At the very gates of the palace, Mordecai remained a watchful presence, ever loyal to both Esther and his Jewish heritage. It was there that he overheard whispers of a conspiracy to assassinate King Xerxes. Mordecai quickly sent word to Esther, who relayed the information to the king in Mordecai's name. The conspirators were captured and executed, but Mordecai's act of loyalty was merely recorded in the royal chronicles, left unrewarded for now. Enter Haman, a man consumed by ambition and blinded by pride. A high-ranking official, Haman had risen to power in Xerxes' court, but his influence was matched only by his ego. When the king commanded that all officials bow before Haman, one man stood in defiance: Mordecai. Haman's fury burned with an intensity far beyond wounded pride. Learning that Mordecai was a Jew ignited a hatred that extended to Mordecai's entire people. It wasn't enough to punish one man. Haman sought to erase an entire nation. The Book of Esther describes how Haman crafted his scheme, convincing King Xerxes with cunning words and promises of silver to fund the campaign. There's a certain people dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom who keep themselves separate. Their customs are different from those of all other people, and they do not obey the king's laws. It is not in the king's best interest to tolerate them. Esther 3:8. With the king's signet ring, Haman sealed a decree that would authorize the destruction of the Jews on the 13th day of the 12th month. Men, women, and children, all were marked for death. Copies of the edict were dispatched to every province, spreading fear and despair. The arrogance of Haman was staggering. He cast lots, or Purim, to determine the date of the annihilation, believing he could control the fate of an entire people. Yet, in his hubris, Haman overlooked one crucial truth. The God of Israel was not absent, even in the shadows of a pagan empire. When Mordecai learned of the edict, he tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, and cried out in the streets of Susa. His mourning was echoed by Jews across the empire. But Mordecai's grief was not without action. He sent word to Esther, urging her to go to the king and plead for her people. Here the tension reaches a fever pitch. Esther, though queen, was not exempt from the risks of palace life. Approaching the king uninvited could mean death, even for her. All the king's officials and the people of the royal provinces know that for any man or woman who approaches the king in the inner court without being summoned, the king has but one law: that they be put to death unless the king extends the gold scepter to them. Esther 4:11. Mordecai's response was both a challenge and a declaration of faith. Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this? Esther 4:13-14. Haman, oblivious to the brewing resistance, reveled in his power. Yet his arrogance would be his undoing. Like the seeds of his hatred, the gallows he constructed for Mordecai's execution were a harbinger of his own fate. What drives someone like Haman to such depths of hatred and evil? Is it pride, insecurity, or the need to assert power at any cost? And how often do we see the Hamans of our world underestimate the resilience and faith of God's people? As the story unfolds, Esther faces a choice that will test her courage and faith. Will she risk her life to save her people? And will Haman's evil plans meet divine justice? Haman's plot reminds us that arrogance and hatred never go unnoticed by God. He is always at work, turning the schemes of the wicked into opportunities for deliverance. Have you ever faced an impossible situation that seemed beyond hope? How did you see God move in ways you didn't expect? The threat was clear and imminent. Haman's edict, sealed with the king's ring, hung over the Jewish people like a storm cloud. While the palace continued to hum with the distractions of royal life, the streets of Susa were filled with wailing and mourning. The Jews were facing extermination, and time was slipping away. Mordecai stood at the center of this crisis, not just as a grieving uncle, but as a voice of courage and faith. Esther, the queen, had unknowingly been swept into a drama far greater than herself. From her elevated position, the calamity seemed distant, yet Mordecai saw the divine hand at work, placing her in the palace precisely for this moment. He had to act, and fast. Sending word through a trusted servant, Mordecai delivered a message that shook the foundations of Esther's comfortable life. Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. Esther 4:13. The palace walls wouldn't protect her from the consequences of Haman's hatred. Esther's initial response was hesitant. She reminded Mordecai of the law. Approaching King Xerxes without being summoned was punishable by death. And the king hadn't called for her in 30 days. It wasn't cowardice, it was survival instinct. Esther knew she was risking her life. All the king's officials know that for any man or woman who approaches the king in the inner court without being summoned, the king has but one law, that they be put to death unless the king extends the gold scepter to them. Esther 4:11. But Mordecai's reply pierced through any rationalization. If you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this? Esther 4:14. For such a time as this. Those words have echoed across generations. Mordecai wasn't just appealing to Esther's position of power. He was challenging her to see the purpose behind it. The beauty that caught the king's eye, the favor that placed her on the throne, all of it had led her to this moment. Esther had been chosen, not by Xerxes, but by God. And suddenly, everything changed. Esther, the young woman who had been swept up by forces beyond her control, became a pillar of courage and faith. She sent her reply, Go, gather together all the Jews who are in Susa, and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my attendants will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish. Esther 4:16. This was no mere act of bravery, it was surrender. Esther embraced the reality that her life was no longer her own. She was willing to lay everything on the line for her people and for the purposes of God. But Mordecai's words weren't just for Esther. They resonate deeply with every believer who has ever wrestled with fear, doubt, or the weight of a calling that seems too great to bear. For such a time as this isn't just about being in the right place. It's about recognizing that God's providence places us in specific moments to fulfill His divine purposes. What does this mean for us today? Perhaps you're standing at a crossroads, faced with a decision that could impact not just your life, but the lives of others. Maybe God is calling you to step out in faith, to speak up, to lead, or to take action in a way that feels overwhelming. Mordecai's challenge reminds us that God's plans will prevail, but the question is whether we will step into the role He's prepared for us. Esther's 3 days of fasting were more than preparation. They were a declaration of dependence on God. Her courage came not from her own strength, but from trusting in the unseen hand of God. As she fasted, the people of Susa joined her, uniting in desperation and faith. And what about us? Are we willing to seek God's guidance in our moments of crisis? Are we ready to embrace the calling He's placed on our lives, even when it feels risky or impossible? Esther's story shows us that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's faith in the face of it. So where is God calling you for such a time as this? Are there opportunities you've been hesitant to embrace, moments where fear has held you back? Remember, God equips those He calls. He doesn't require perfection, just willingness. As Esther prepared to take her place in God's unfolding plan, the tension in the story reached its peak. The stakes were enormous, but so was the faith that would carry her forward. Comment below with your own "for such a time as this" moment. How has God called you to step into His plans? And don't forget to share this Deep Bible Stories video with someone who needs to be reminded that God's timing is always perfect. Let's move forward together into the next chapter of Esther's extraordinary story. The echoes of fasting prayers had barely faded in the homes of Susa when Esther made her decision. For 3 days, she had joined her people in seeking God's guidance, abstaining from food and drink, and steeling herself for the task ahead. The fear that once gripped her heart was now replaced with a quiet, unshakable resolve. "If I perish, I perish." Her words reverberated in her mind as she adorned herself in royal robes. Every movement felt weighty, symbolic. This wasn't just about appearance. The royal garments signified her authority as queen, yet her heart carried the identity that truly mattered, a servant of God, chosen for this moment. The transition from Mordecai's challenge to Esther's choice was a pivotal turning point. She wasn't stepping into the king's court as a queen seeking favor. She was entering as an intercessor, standing in the gap for her people. The stakes could not have been higher. The law of Persia was clear. No one approached the king uninvited. To do so was to risk instant death unless the king extended his golden scepter. This law had no exceptions, not even for the queen. Esther knew the peril she faced, yet she also knew something greater. The God of her ancestors, the one who parted the Red Sea and toppled the walls of Jericho, was still at work. As Esther walked toward the inner court, the weight of silence pressed down on her. Every step echoed with the risk of rejection, humiliation, or execution. The guards looked on, their hands hovering near their weapons, prepared to enforce the unyielding law of the king. And then the doors opened. King Xerxes sat on his throne, a figure of immense power, his piercing gaze sweeping the room. Esther's heart pounded as their eyes met. For a moment the world seemed to hold its breath. Would he extend the scepter, or would this be the end? The golden rod moved. Relief flooded the room as the scepter pointed toward Esther, signaling her welcome. But for her, this was just the beginning. She approached the throne with measured grace, bowing low, and waited for the king to speak. "What is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be given to you." Esther 5:3. The king's words were generous, but Esther knew this was no time for impulsiveness. Instead of revealing Haman's plot outright, she invited the king and Haman to a banquet. Her wisdom and tact were as much a part of her bravery as her initial approach to the throne. She understood that timing was everything. This moment of courage wasn't born overnight. Esther's boldness was the culmination of her faith, her fasting, and her identity as one chosen by God. She had embraced her calling, not because the outcome was guaranteed, but because her trust was in a God who was greater than the risks. Esther's bravery wasn't just about saving her people, it was about inspiring a legacy of faith in action. Her story reminds us that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's stepping forward in spite of it, trusting that God's providence will guide us through the unknown. What about us? Are there moments when we're called to take a step of faith, even when the risks seem insurmountable? Esther's decision challenges us to consider what obedience to God looks like in the face of fear. It's a reminder that our faith must be active, not passive, a force that propels us into action, even when the odds are against us. Her actions also speak to the power of intercession. Esther didn't approach the king for herself, but for her people. She embodied the role of a mediator, willing to risk everything to secure their deliverance. In this way, her courage mirrors the ultimate act of intercession, Christ's sacrifice on the cross. So, what steps of faith is God calling you to take today? Are there risks you've been hesitant to embrace, moments where fear has held you back? Let Esther's story remind you that courage isn't about being fearless. It's about trusting the one who holds your destiny in his hands. As we move forward, we'll see how Esther's strategic decision leads to a banquet that will change the course of history. But for now, reflect on the boldness it took for her to approach the throne. What bold steps might God be asking you to take in your own life? Esther's decision to approach King Xerxes was courageous, but her mission was far from over. While the scepter's extension had opened the door, the real test lay ahead. Her people's survival hung in the balance, and she had only one chance to reveal the truth. With wisdom born of faith and strategy, Esther prepared for the moment that would change everything. As we leave the scene of Esther standing boldly before the king, we transition to an intimate yet tension-filled setting, a royal banquet. This wasn't just any feast, this was the stage Esther had meticulously set where courage and providence would converge. The banquet room was dazzling, its golden walls shimmering with torchlight. King Xerxes reclined on his throne-like seat, the ever-arrogant Haman at his side, his smug grin betraying his sense of invincibility. The air was thick with anticipation, yet only Esther knew the weight of what was about to unfold. "Tell me, Queen Esther," Xerxes said, his voice echoing through the hall, "what is your petition? It will be granted to you. What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be given." Esther 7:2. This was the moment. But Esther paused, her demeanor calm yet commanding. The wisdom of waiting had served her well. She knew the gravity of her words would carry more weight in God's perfect timing. Her voice steady, she began, "If I have found favor in your eyes, O king, and if it pleases your majesty, grant me my life. This is my petition. And spare my people. This is my request." Esther 7:3. The room fell silent. Xerxes leaned forward, confusion and concern shadowing his expression. "What could she mean?" Esther continued, her voice unwavering, though the truth she spoke was laden with risk. "For I and my people have been sold to be destroyed, killed and annihilated. If we had merely been sold as slaves, I would have kept silent, because no such distress would justify disturbing the king." Esther 7:4. The king's eyes narrowed, his grip tightening on the armrest of his chair. A dangerous edge crept into his voice as he demanded, "Who is he? Where is the man who has dared to do such a thing?" Esther 7:5. The spotlight shifted, and all eyes turned to Haman. Esther's gaze, sharp and resolute, met Haman's as she declared, "The adversary and enemy is this vile Haman." Esther 7:6. The color drained from Haman's face. The man who had been so confident, so sure of his schemes, now stood exposed, trembling before the fury of the king. Xerxes rose in a rage, pacing the banquet hall. The man who had trusted Haman, elevated him to power, now saw his treachery laid bare. As the weight of Esther's words settled, the scene became a masterclass in divine timing. Esther had waited until the perfect moment, not in fear, but in faith. Her patience allowed the king to see the truth clearly, her courage ensuring the gravity of her accusation struck with full force. The turning point of this banquet wasn't just Esther's boldness, it was a demonstration of God's providence. Every delay, every calculated step had led to this moment of truth. God's hand was evident, weaving together the details in ways Esther couldn't fully see, but trusted implicitly. The king stormed out into the garden, his anger blazing. Meanwhile, Haman, consumed by terror, fell at Esther's feet, pleading for his life. But his desperation only sealed his fate. When Xerxes returned, he found Haman groveling near the queen, misinterpreting his actions as further insult. The judgment was swift and just. The gallows Haman had prepared for Mordecai became his own undoing. The same arrogance that had driven his hatred now led to his downfall, a poetic justice that revealed God's sovereign hand in the narrative. This banquet was more than a turning point in Esther's story. It was a testament to the power of courage and faith in God's timing. Esther's bravery didn't merely save her people. It also exposed the destructive nature of pride and the triumph of truth over lies. As believers today, Esther's banquet challenges us to consider, are we willing to trust God's timing even when the stakes feel impossibly high? Do we have the patience to wait for the right moment to speak or act, knowing He is orchestrating every detail? This pivotal moment reminds us that courage paired with faith can topple even the most formidable enemies. It's a call to step boldly into the roles God has placed before us, trusting that His timing is always perfect. What about you? Are there areas in your life where you need to wait on God's timing, or moments where boldness is required? As we move into the aftermath of this banquet, we'll see how the story unfolds toward deliverance and triumph. But for now, reflect on the beauty of God's providence in this turning point, where a courageous queen and a faithful God changed the course of history. The banquet's tension had shattered like glass, leaving Haman exposed and King Xerxes ablaze with anger. The once confident Haman, who reveled in his lofty position and meticulously planned revenge against Mordecai, now stood as a trembling shadow of his former self. His arrogance had woven a noose, and the very gallows he erected to destroy an innocent man would now seal his fate. After Esther's bold reveal at the banquet, the king stormed out into the palace garden, wrestling with betrayal. Xerxes had trusted Haman implicitly, elevating him to a position of honor and granting him access to royal authority. Yet now, that trust lay in ruins, shattered by the horrifying truth that Haman had plotted the extermination of the queen's people. Inside, Haman's fear consumed him. For a man who had spent his life orchestrating power plays, this was a position he had never envisioned, pleading for mercy at the feet of a queen. Falling before Esther, Haman begged for his life, his once proud demeanor crumbling into desperation. But the timing of his actions only deepened the king's wrath. As Xerxes re-entered the banquet hall, he found Haman groveling near the queen, a sight he interpreted as an act of further violation. "Will he even molest the queen while she's with me in the house?" the king roared, his fury uncontainable. Esther 7:8. In moments, the guards seized Haman. The wheels of justice began to turn swiftly, but it wasn't merely human justice at play, it was divine providence. One of the eunuchs, Harbona, stepped forward with a suggestion that dripped with irony. A gallows 75 feet high stands by Haman's house. He had it made for Mordecai, who spoke up to help the king. Esther 7:9. The king's decision was immediate and unyielding. Hang him on it! As Haman was led away, his fate was a chilling reminder of the consequences of unchecked pride and malice. The gallows he had constructed with such glee, imagining Mordecai's humiliation and death, now loomed as a monument to his own downfall. Haman's story serves as a stark lesson in the dangers of pride. His rise to power had been fueled by his insatiable need for recognition and control. He couldn't tolerate Mordecai's refusal to bow, seeing it as a personal affront rather than an act of faith. This unchecked pride led him to orchestrate not only Mordecai's death, but the annihilation of an entire people. But in the end, God's justice prevailed. The gallows became more than a tool of execution. It became a symbol of poetic justice. The wicked schemes Haman devised turned back on him, illustrating a timeless truth found throughout Scripture. Whoever digs a pit will fall into it. If someone rolls a stone, it will roll back on them. Proverbs 26:27. Haman's downfall wasn't just about punishment, it was a testament to God's sovereignty. Throughout the Book of Esther, God's name is never mentioned, yet his presence is unmistakable. The intricate timing of events from Esther's rise to queenhood to the king's sleepless night that led him to honor Mordecai points to a divine hand orchestrating every detail. In Haman's demise, we see the fulfillment of promises made long before. God had vowed to protect his people, and though the path was perilous and uncertain, his faithfulness never wavered. Haman's story reminds us that no scheme of man can thwart God's plans, no matter how powerful the opposition may seem. As we reflect on this moment, it's natural to ask, where are we in this story? Are there places in our lives where pride has blinded us, leading us down a dangerous path? Are we building gallows for others through bitterness or revenge, only to find ourselves ensnared by our own schemes? Haman's downfall challenges us to examine our hearts and to trust in God's justice rather than taking matters into our own hands. It's a call to humility, a reminder that pride goes before destruction, but those who humble themselves before God will find grace. This moment also offers comfort to those who feel oppressed or wronged. Haman's story reminds us that God sees every injustice and will act in his perfect timing. Even when his presence feels hidden, his justice is never absent. As the story continues, we'll see how the downfall of one man leads to the salvation of an entire people. But for now, let this moment stand as a powerful testament to the truth that God's justice will always prevail, and his plans cannot be undone. Where have you seen pride lead to a fall, and what did you learn from it? From the ashes of Haman's downfall, hope began to rise. The gallows, once meant to destroy, Mordecai had instead marked the end of their greatest adversary, but the danger wasn't fully extinguished. Haman's decree, signed with the king's authority, still loomed over the Jewish people like a dark cloud. Though Haman was dead, the law he authored was irrevocable, leaving the Jews still vulnerable to annihilation. But where there was no visible path, God was already working through Esther and Mordecai to secure salvation. As the dust settled from Haman's execution, Esther once again approached the king. Though the risk was lessened, the weight of her request bore down heavily on her shoulders. Falling at the king's feet, she wept and pleaded for her people's lives. "If it pleases the king," she said, "and if I have found favor in his sight, let an order be written to revoke the dispatches that Haman devised to destroy the Jews." Esther 8:5. The king, moved by her courage and love for her people, extended his golden scepter, but even with his favor, there was a problem. Persian law could not be revoked, even by the king himself. The decree calling for the annihilation of the Jews on the 13th day of the 12th month was still in effect. The clock was ticking, and the stakes had never been higher. In this moment, we see the brilliance of Mordecai and the providence of God working in tandem. Mordecai devised a counter-decree, allowing the Jews to defend themselves against any who would attack them. This new decree, also sealed with the king's ring, spread rapidly throughout the empire. Imagine the scene, royal couriers racing against time, carrying the message to every corner of the vast Persian Empire, from the citadel of Susa to the most distant provinces. The Jewish people who had been living in fear now found hope and strength. When the fateful day arrived, it was not the Jews who were destroyed, but their enemies. The tables turned in spectacular fashion. In Susa alone, 500 attackers fell, and throughout the empire, thousands more were defeated. What had seemed like certain doom became a day of triumph, not because of military might, but because of the unseen hand of God guiding events. But the victory wasn't just physical, it was spiritual. The salvation of the Jews in Persia echoed the larger narrative of God's covenant with his people. Though his name is never explicitly mentioned in the Book of Esther, his presence is undeniable. The intricate timing of events, the courage of Esther, and the wisdom of Mordecai all point to a divine plan unfolding. This moment of deliverance also carried profound spiritual symbolism. Just as the Jews were saved from destruction through a decree of life and defense, we too are offered salvation through God's ultimate decree of grace and redemption in Christ. What the enemy intends for harm, God turns for good, revealing his providence even in the most impossible circumstances. For the Jews, this victory wasn't just about survival, it was about transformation. The fear that once gripped them gave way to joy and celebration. Mordecai's rise to prominence as second-in-command to King Xerxes brought justice and honor, while the establishment of the Feast of Purim ensured that this story of salvation would be remembered for generations to come. But what does this moment mean for us today? It reminds us that God's providence is always at work, even when we cannot see it. In the darkest moments, when the odds seem insurmountable, he is still writing a story of deliverance. Esther and Mordecai didn't have the luxury of seeing the full picture, yet they acted in faith and courage, trusting that God would intervene. Are there areas in your life where the odds seem stacked against you, where fear and uncertainty threaten to overshadow hope? Esther's story is a powerful reminder that God's plans cannot be thwarted, and his love for his people is unfailing. This victory also challenges us to consider our own roles in God's story. Just as Esther and Mordecai stepped into positions of influence for such a time as this, we too are called to act with courage and faith in the face of adversity. The salvation of the Jews wasn't just their story, it's ours as well. It points to the greater salvation offered through Christ, the ultimate deliverance from sin and death. Where have you seen God turn impossible circumstances into moments of triumph? Let's celebrate together the God who saves, the God who redeems, and the God who is always faithful. With the salvation of the Jews secured and the enemies of God's people defeated, the story of Esther reaches its triumphant conclusion. But this victory was not meant to be forgotten, nor was it meant to be just another chapter in history. It was a turning point that demanded remembrance, a moment when fear gave way to celebration, despair was replaced by joy, and survival turned into a testimony of God's unseen hand. After the day of deliverance, Mordecai and Esther took steps to ensure that this extraordinary act of salvation would be remembered by every generation. A decree went out across the Persian Empire, establishing a new festival, the Feast of Purim. Purim, named after the pur or lot that Haman cast to determine the date of the Jews' destruction, would now serve as an enduring reminder that the plans of the wicked cannot stand against the providence of God. What was once a symbol of doom had been transformed into a celebration of deliverance. But how did this festival take shape, and what does it truly represent? Mordecai sent letters to all the Jews in the empire, commanding them to observe the 14th and 15th days of Adar as days of feasting, joy, and giving gifts to one another and to the poor. Esther 9:20-22. These days would forever commemorate their deliverance from annihilation, a reminder that no matter how dire the circumstances, God's providence can bring salvation when all seems lost. The celebration was not just about survival, it was about gratitude, gratitude for life, for community, and for a God who works behind the scenes. Imagine the streets of ancient Persia, filled with laughter, the sharing of food, and the exchange of gifts. For a people who had lived under the shadow of Haman's decree, this joy was nothing short of miraculous. What makes Purim especially unique is the context of the Book of Esther itself. As many have noted, God's name is never mentioned in the entire story, and yet his presence permeates every event. The establishment of Purim serves as an acknowledgement of this unseen hand, a way of saying, even when we couldn't see you, Lord, you were there. This is a lesson that transcends time. How often do we fail to recognize God's hand in our own lives simply because it doesn't appear in the way we expect? Purim challenges us to look deeper, to see that God's providence is always at work, even in the mundane or chaotic moments of our lives. The Feast of Purim was also a way of turning celebration into an act of worship. By gathering together, retelling the story, and rejoicing in their deliverance, the Jewish people weren't just celebrating. They were honoring the God who had saved them. Even today, Purim remains a vibrant celebration in Jewish communities around the world. The Book of Esther, or the Megillah, is read aloud, and every time Haman's name is mentioned, it's drowned out by boos, jeers, and the clatter of noisemakers. This act is not just playful, it's deeply symbolic, a reminder that evil has no lasting power in the face of God's justice. Feasting, giving to the poor, and sharing joy with one another are also integral to the celebration. These acts reflect the heart of a people transformed by gratitude and determined to honor the God who had not abandoned them in their hour of need. While Purim is a uniquely Jewish celebration, its message resonates far beyond its cultural and religious origins. For believers, it's a powerful reminder of the God who never slumbers, who works all things together for good, and who uses even the smallest acts of courage to accomplish his grand purposes. How often do we stop to celebrate God's faithfulness in our own lives? In the hustle and chaos of everyday existence, it's easy to forget the moments when his unseen hand has guided us, protected us, or delivered us from situations that seemed hopeless. Purim invites us to pause and reflect. Where have you seen God's deliverance in your life? How can you turn your gratitude into a celebration that honors him? As the Jews celebrated their victory year after year, Purim became more than just a festival. It became a legacy. It was a way of teaching future generations about the God who saves, about the courage of Esther, and about the justice that triumphs over evil. And isn't that what our faith is all about? Passing on the stories of God's goodness, his faithfulness, and his power to the next generation, so that they, too, can trust him in their time of need. How have you seen God's unseen hand in your life? Let's take a moment together to rejoice in the God who delivers, who redeems, and who turns mourning into dancing. The streets of Susa had quieted, the gallows dismantled, and the echoes of celebration had faded into the rhythms of everyday life. The Feast of Purim was now a vibrant tradition, but one lingering question remained. Where was God in all this? In the entire Book of Esther, his name is never mentioned, not once, yet his fingerprints are unmistakable, woven into every twist and turn of the story. Transitioning from the joy of Purim, we are faced with a profound truth. Esther's story is one of faith in the unseen. It teaches us that even when God seems silent, he is always present, orchestrating events with divine precision. But why is his name absent from the narrative? Could this omission be intentional, a challenge to see his hand when it's not explicitly revealed? The Book of Esther unfolds like a tapestry of coincidences, too perfect to be accidental. Esther, an orphaned Jewish girl, just happens to become queen in a foreign empire. Mordecai overhears a plot against the king at just the right moment to save his life. Haman's plans unravel through a series of seemingly random events, culminating in his execution on the gallows meant for Mordecai. None of these moments are attributed directly to God, yet they bear the hallmarks of divine intervention. His name may be absent, but his presence is undeniable. It's as if the author whispers, "Look closer. Can you see him?" For the Jewish people facing annihilation, the absence of God's explicit intervention could have been deeply unsettling. Yet Esther and Mordecai chose to act with courage and faith, trusting that God was working behind the scenes. This kind of faith without seeing, is one of the most challenging and transformative aspects of our relationship with God. In our own lives, how often do we struggle with this same challenge? When prayers seem unanswered, when life feels chaotic, when God's voice feels distant, do we trust that he is still at work? Esther's story reminds us that God's silence is not his absence, and his hiddenness does not mean inaction. The absence of God's name in Esther serves another purpose. It invites every reader, regardless of faith or background, to see the power of providence. Unlike other biblical texts that explicitly invoke God, Esther operates in the realm of the subtle, showing us that God's hand moves even in the ordinary and the mundane. Consider this. If God's name had been prominently featured, would the story have the same universal resonance? By leaving his name unspoken, the author leaves room for us to see God in our own lives, in the coincidences, the chance meetings, the closed doors that lead to better paths. Esther's faith and courage challenge us to examine our own lives. How often do we wait for a thunderous voice from heaven when God is speaking in whispers? How often do we look for grand miracles when his hand is at work in the smallest details? In seasons of uncertainty, it can feel like God is absent. But Esther's story reminds us that he is always present. When the cancer diagnosis comes, when the job is lost, when the relationship falls apart, God is still there, guiding, sustaining, and orchestrating a plan we cannot yet see. Imagine for a moment that you are Esther, standing before the king, unsure if you will live or die. You don't hear a voice from heaven. You don't see a sign. All you have is the quiet conviction that this is your moment, that God has placed you here for such a time as this. This is faith in action, not waiting for certainty, but stepping forward with trust. It's the kind of faith that can change lives, families, communities, and even nations. The Book of Esther teaches us that the absence of God's name does not mean the absence of his power. It's a story for anyone who has ever wondered if God is listening, if he cares, if he is there. It's a reminder that faith is not about seeing, it's about trusting. As we reflect on this final chapter of Esther, ask yourself, where have I seen God's hidden hand in my life? Where have I doubted his presence, only to realize later that he was there all along? The echoes of the Feast of Purim may fade, and the gallows where Haman met his end may no longer stand, but the lessons of Esther's story endure. The final chapters of her tale don't just belong to the annals of history, they speak directly to us today. If Esther's journey teaches us anything, it's that moments of courage aren't just for queens. They're for every believer who faces the choice between fear and faith. Transitioning from the hidden hand of God, we now turn our focus to how Esther's story resonates in the modern world. It's easy to dismiss her bravery as something extraordinary, reserved for someone chosen by God to save a nation. But what if you are Esther in your own story? What if you, too, are called for such a time as this? When Esther decided to approach the king uninvited, she was fully aware of the risks. Death was a real possibility, yet she didn't let fear dictate her actions. Her words, "If I perish, I perish," ring across the ages as a testament to faith that chooses obedience over self-preservation. How often do we shrink back in fear when confronted with challenges that demand bold faith? Perhaps it's not standing before a king, but standing up for your faith in a hostile environment. Perhaps it's speaking truth to a loved one, stepping out of a comfort zone, or taking a leap of faith into the unknown. Esther reminds us that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's acting despite it. God's providence doesn't always come with guarantees of safety or success, but it comes with his promise that he is with us, just as he was with Esther. Esther didn't save her people with grand speeches or miracles. Her victory began with one simple, terrifying step: entering the king's presence. That single act set off a chain reaction of events that turned despair into deliverance. What is the step of faith God is calling you to take today? It may seem small, but like Esther, you cannot underestimate its potential impact. Faith is often like a stone thrown into a still pond. Its ripples reach farther than you can imagine. One of the most striking aspects of Esther's story is her solitude. She didn't have a crowd cheering her on or the immediate assurance of victory. Often, the moments that define us require us to stand alone, trusting that God is with us even when no one else is. How many of us are willing to stand firm in our convictions, even when it's unpopular or costly? Esther shows us that even one person, standing in the strength of God, can change the course of history. We live in a world where fear often dictates decisions, fear of rejection, failure, or consequences. Yet, Esther's story challenges us to rise above fear and trust in God's providence. Whether it's confronting injustice, sharing your faith, or simply trusting God's plan for your life, Esther calls us to embrace our "for such a time as this" moment. Ask yourself, what step of faith is God calling you to take? Is it a conversation you've been avoiding, a risk you've been too afraid to take, or a cause you feel called to champion? Whatever it is, remember that God's providence often works through our obedience. Esther's story didn't just save a generation. It established a legacy of courage that continues to inspire. Each act of faith we take, no matter how small, can have a ripple effect far beyond what we see. You may not save a nation, but your courage could impact a family, a community, or even just one person, and that's enough. As we bring Esther's story to a close, let's reflect on its timeless challenge. We may not see God's hand as clearly as we'd like, but we can trust that He is always working, even in the shadows. Esther's life shows us that courage is not about being fearless, it's about being faithful. What will your moment of courage look like? How will you step out in faith today, trusting in the unseen God who moves behind the scenes? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to share this deep Bible stories video with someone who needs encouragement to act boldly in their faith. Let's inspire one another to live with the courage, conviction, and faith that Esther exemplified. Stay blessed.